So, today's video is going to be especially awesome because I'll have a chance to review a brand new desktop from System76. The Thelio has been refreshed, but unfortunately, the desktop has yet to arrive in the studio, so I have no idea what's going on. I mean, System76 promised me that the review unit would be here today so I could get started on reviewing it, but it has yet to show up. And the tracking number was very weird too. It was like a outer space address or something from some other galaxy. So I have no idea what to make of that. But either way, unfortunately, we'll just have to do the review another day because, like I mentioned, it has yet to show up. I have no idea what's... How? I can't explain that. Hello and welcome back to Learn Linux TV. In today's video, we're going to check out the refreshed Thelio desktop from System76. And the Thelio desktop itself has been my favorite Linux desktop PC for quite a while now. So imagine my excitement when I found out that the Thelio desktop was going to get a refresh. I couldn't wait to check it out. And the thing is, I was actually a little surprised that the Thelio desktop was getting a refresh at all. I mean, the thing is, System76 is constantly iterating on the Thelio. They're always making refinements and improvements all over the place. So a refresh was not something that I saw coming, but here it is. So in that case, that means it's time for me to review the new model, which is exactly what I'm going to do in today's video. But before I get into that, I do need to give you guys a quick disclaimer. Just like always, I'm going to be giving you guys my unbiased opinion about the new Thelio desktop. I'll give you all the details about what I do and don't like about this unit, and by the end of the video, you'll have my uncensored opinion about this product. And in addition to that, I never allow anyone to screen my review videos before you guys get to see them. So System76, in this case, is seeing this video for the first time. At the same time, you guys are seeing this video for the first time. So in this video, I'm going to be giving you guys a full review of this computer, which will include a look internally at the chassis. Why? Well, if I didn't need a screwdriver to review a desktop, then I'm not reviewing it right. Now, I'm really excited to dive into this desktop and tell you all about it, but before I do, I need to take a moment to mention the sponsor for today's video, which is ThinLinc. And you know what? ThinLinc is actually celebrating their 20th anniversary as a company, which is very impressive. But ThinLinc itself, as a product, is also very exciting. And what exactly is ThinLinc, you might ask? Well, ThinLinc is a remote desktop solution with a focus on Linux compatibility. And with ThinLinc, you can set up remote access to your infrastructure very easily. And with this solution, there's a server component and also client apps that work on not only Linux desktops, but also macOS, Windows, and even from within your browser as well. In addition, ThinLinc is based on open source technologies and even supports server-side graphical acceleration through virtual-GL, which provides you with 3D acceleration that you normally wouldn't have access to within remote desktop solutions. And best of all, ThinLinc is completely free for up to 10 simultaneous users. So for those of you that have a home lab, this might be especially good for you guys. But not just home lab, it's also good for small offices, large data centers. ThinLinc is able to expand and scale for however many Linux servers that might be under your jurisdiction. So if you're looking for a remote desktop solution, then definitely check out ThinLinc. And if you use the URL that you see on the screen right now, then you're also supporting Learn Linux TV by letting them know that you heard about ThinLinc from this channel. Thank you so much to ThinLinc for sponsoring today's video. I really appreciate it. And now let's get right into the review. I can't wait to tell you guys all about the newly refreshed Thelio desktop, so let's get right into it. And here it is in all its glory. The new model of the Thelio desktop has some really interesting changes to the chassis that I can't wait to tell you guys about. But first of all, what exactly is a Thelio desktop? If you haven't actually seen my previous reviews for earlier models of this desktop line, then you might not have any idea what I'm talking about. And that would be a shame because I consider the Thelio desktop to be the gold standard when it comes to Linux desktop PCs. And the Thelio desktop itself is manufactured by System76, a company that you've probably heard of if you've been following Linux at all. Their entire business is set up around selling Linux-compatible computers. And they've been selling these computers for quite a while now. The Thelio line is relatively new, at least by computer model standards. I believe it was somewhere around 2018 or so when this particular line of computers was introduced, and here we are several years later with a brand new model. And the first thing you'll probably notice about the Thelio line of desktops is that they definitely stand out when compared to other PCs. I mean, they almost look like a piece of furniture. For those of you of a certain age, you might remember how at one time, appliances you purchased were basically like a piece of furniture. I mean, remember console TVs? How cool were those? Back then, anytime you spend your hard-earned money on something, the expectation was that that particular appliance was going to last a while and be worth the money. And that kind of makes sense to me. I mean, if you're going to buy something, you really don't want it to be disposable. But nowadays, a lot of computers practically are. But the Thelio is the closest thing when it comes to PCs that we have that follows that older mindset. They're built to last, they're easily serviceable by the consumer, and that's the way that it should be. And the appearance of the Thelio desktop is awesome. It literally looks like a piece of furniture. In my studio, my Thelio matches the wood grain of my desk and speakers, so for me, it really fits in here. But Thelio desktops are more than just their appearance. The inside of the chassis is very well built, and there's even a custom I/O board with open source firmware, and that's something that we Linux people can especially appreciate. But now, we have a brand new model of Thelio to enjoy. And I've been a fan of the Thelio desktop, like I mentioned, for quite a while now. And the Thelio that you see in the background of the majority of the videos on this channel is the very same desktop that I use for rendering all of the videos on this channel. But what exactly is different when it comes to the new model? Well, let's talk about the most obvious change first. The wood grain on the side of the Thelio that's been there for its entire run so far has been replaced with a brand new accent panel that's visible on the front of the chassis, and there's several different variations of this accent panel that you could choose between. And at first, that might not seem like an extreme change from the previous model. I mean, even the older model had variations of the wood grain available that you could choose from when you go to order one, color variations. But unlike the wood grain on the previous model, the accent panel is actually user swappable. You can change the accent panel at any time, so if your mood changes, you could simply apply a matching accent color. In order to swap the accent panel, all you have to do is slightly lift the front of the desktop, and then you gently pull down on the accent panel, and it comes right off. Once it's released, you then swap it with a different one. And a handful of these accent panels are included with the new Thelio. And you know what? I actually have some mixed opinions when it comes to this new accent panel style. I mean, personally, I really did enjoy the wood grain on the older model. It took up the majority of one of the sides of the chassis, so that was a lot larger than the accent panel is on this particular model. But to be fair, there were some quirks when it comes to having the wood grain on one side of the computer with the older model. Whether or not anyone was able to see the majority of that wood grain really depended on which side of the monitor you happen to place your computer next to. I mean, depending on that, the majority of that wood grain panel might be against a wall or something like that. So I could totally understand wanting to move that to the front of the case. I think that actually does make a lot of sense. When it comes to my preference for the wood grain being on the side of the desktop because I just think it looks cooler, that's a personal preference. I totally understand the direction they're going and why they decided to do this. And to be fair, I really do enjoy being able to swap the accent panel. I mean, that is a lot of fun. And actually, the ability to swap the accent panel is the biggest change when it comes to the chassis. But there's actually so many smaller improvements all over the place that I'm not even sure that I'll be able to mention each and every change and refinement in this video, but I'll definitely try to mention as many things as I can find. In fact, how about we switch gears right now and take a look at the chassis in greater detail, inside and out. And the chassis on this new version, just like with previous models, consists of an extremely solid build with the majority of it being made of metal. The exterior of the chassis has a very fun design, and the accent panel in the front isn't the only thing that it has going for it. We also have the Denver Mountain symbolized on the sides, and we also have some clever Easter eggs as well, such as planets within the fan vent that you might not notice at first glance, And as a bit of trivia, those planets are aligned in the same orientation they were actually in at the start of the Unix epoch. Now, the latter aspects that I just mentioned aren't entirely new, but definitely worth mentioning if you didn't already know about that. On the back of the unit, the various ports that are built into the motherboard are exposed through the metal chassis with smooth professional cutouts. And one of the things that I noticed with this new model is that the ports have labels on them which are etched right into the chassis. And that might not seem like a big deal at first, but the lack of labels was something that I later became a little frustrated with when it comes to the model of Thelio that I have in the studio. To be fair, port labels aren't really required. I mean, I'm well aware of what a USB port looks like, for example, but where the previous model became a bit tedious was the absence of port labels for the 3.5mm audio jacks. Mine has a bunch of these jacks, so in order for me to make sure my speakers were all plugged into the proper jacks, it took trial and error. Now the ports are labeled so that there's no question what each of these ports are for. Now, the only suggestion that I might make to further enhance the rear of the chassis is to have some sort of covers over the HDMI and display ports when you have a GPU. That way there's less of a chance that we might plug the monitor into the wrong port. So if you have a GPU on your Thelio, for example, then you would definitely want to make sure that you're plugging in your display into the GPU and not the integrated ports on the motherboard. But that's not a big deal, so that's just a light mention. So the Thelio continues to be aesthetically pleasing with this new version, and I just gave you a brief overview of the chassis, but how about we break into this computer, tear it open, and see what's inside of it. The internal chassis is easily revealed by removing the thumb screws on the back of the case, which then releases the cover over the chassis that you can then lift up off of the chassis to reveal the internals. And inside the case, you can see just how sturdy the chassis is. There's even a metal bracket to make sure that the GPU doesn't budge at all during your gaming or rendering sessions. But that's not all. Airflow is taken very seriously here with a metal cage around the fans to ensure that airflow is pushed out of the case efficiently. The intake fan is at the bottom of the case with feet on the bottom of the chassis itself that keeps it lifted off the desk with a gap that's large enough to pull in air, and that air will then be forced out of the back of the case. And by removing the fan cage, you can reveal even more of the internal parts that come with this computer. And one of the things that I like most about the chassis design is how easy it is to upgrade it and service the parts that are inside the case. For example, let's take a look at adding an SSD. Sure, installing an SSD has never been all that difficult to do on any desktop computer, but there's a really neat hard drive cage that can be revealed by removing the cover that you're seeing on the screen right now. And after removing that cover, you can easily install another SSD, and you do so by grabbing a few of the screws that are located right there at the top of the chassis, so they give you extra screws. That's pretty cool. You then attach those screws to the SSD itself, and then you simply slide the SSD into the cage. And when you attach a new SSD, it actually slides into a custom I/O board, and there's a lot of expandability when it comes to adding storage. If you want to use a Thelio as a server, for example, I'd imagine that being able to easily install SSDs would make for a great NAS device in addition to the Thelio being an awesome desktop. So when it comes to the overall design of the chassis, it's still my favorite. There's small refinements all over the place that are definitely welcome, and I really like the direction that they're going with this. Now, part of me still misses the larger wood grain of the previous model, but I will concede that the new direction actually makes more sense. Now, as great as the case is, there is one downside that I want to make sure that you guys are aware of, and you've probably already noticed it. There's no USB ports on the front of the tower. Still. Now, that's always been the case, so the lack of front USB ports on this new model, that's not new. But the fact that this new model also doesn't have USB ports on the front of the case was quite surprising because every time I talk about the Thelio line of desktops, and even when I review them myself, I always see comments in the comments thread that are asking for USB ports on the front of the case. Now, to be fair, not everybody cares about that, but for some people, that actually matters a lot. While it might not be a problem for me to reach behind the case and plug something in, for some people, that's a big deal. For example, if somebody has a physical disability that makes it difficult or even impossible for them to reach behind the case, well, for those individuals, they're especially going to be frustrated that there's no USB ports on the front of the tower. Now, to be fair, when it comes to adding USB ports to the front of the case, that probably will deter from the aesthetically pleasing dynamic of this case itself. But if any company is able to find a way to cleverly hide USB ports on the front of the case, then that company is definitely System76. I mean, that's a company of unicorns anyway. They've done some amazing things, so I would think that adding USB ports would not be a challenge for them at all. So in my personal opinion, it just doesn't seem like adding USB ports to the front of the case or finding a clever way to do that would be a big challenge for System76 at all. When it comes to me, while I may not have a physical disability myself, I also don't have my current Thelio model next to my keyboard either, so I worked around this issue by purchasing a couple of USB hubs that clamp to the edge of my desk, and I also bought a USB extension cable as well, so I do have USB ports that are easily within reach. And not only that, if you have a launch keyboard, then that gives you USB ports right there on the keyboard, which is probably the easiest way to access USB ports. But not everybody is going to have that particular keyboard. But if you want a cheap solution to this problem, then I'll leave a link below to the USB hubs that I purchased for my Thelio that bring the USB ports all the way to the edge of the desk directly underneath my monitor. Anyway, that's enough about the USB ports for now. The overall design of the Thelio desktop is really, really awesome and I love it. So I don't want to spend too much time on the USB aspect of it, but I did want to make you guys aware of that. Anyway, I've spent a great deal of time going over the chassis because, well, the chassis is really cool. Why wouldn't I go over that in great detail? But also, what about the individual hardware components that are contained within the Thelio? Let's go over those as well. And the chosen hardware components when it comes to Thelio desktops is one of my favorite things about them. And what makes that great is the fact that System76 handpicks hardware that is known to be Linux compatible. In fact, they take Linux compatibility very seriously. And sure, you can certainly build your very own Linux computer by just handpicking your own parts and doing that research yourself. You can absolutely do that. But for some people, they may not want to deal with that. They might want a company to pick the components that are known to work with Linux. So that way, all they have to do is plug in the computer and have a reasonable expectation that everything works out of the box. And that's one of the greatest things that System76 gives us. So by purchasing a computer made by System76, then you are buying a computer that is Linux compatible, and you get that out-of-the-box experience that you might get with proprietary operating systems and computers, with the computer in this case being open source, and the operating system being open source as well, so it's like a win-win. But the most interesting part about the hardware components of the Thelio is that the overall Thelio desktop is pretty much the desktop PC equivalent of a rolling release distribution of Linux. Now, before I elaborate on that, I just want to mention I'm not talking about rolling releases in the same way that some Linux distributions are extremely bleeding edge by being rolling, and they often have breakage as a result. Imagine a Linux distribution that's rolling that isn't as bleeding edge and is a lot more stable, but is still constantly changing nonetheless. Well, we have the equivalent of that idea here with the Thelio. For example, the model that shipped to me includes an AMD Ryzen 9 5900X CPU, but if you were to order this new model, is that the CPU that you would also end up with? Well, maybe, but maybe not. Basically, when new hardware components are released, such as a new generation of AMD or Intel CPUs, then System76 makes those available after they test them. That doesn't mean that they're going to attempt to sell you an entirely new model. I mean, a lot of PC makers out there would absolutely try to do that, but the Thelio that you end up buying is going to be a snapshot of the parts that are available in the industry at the time that you ordered that particular desktop. And that's much in the same way that an Arch Linux installation ISO image is a snapshot of the packages that are available for that distro as of the time that ISO image was created. So here we have the desktop equivalent of that same idea. In fact, System76 is always iterating on the hardware and revisions to the chassis. They never really stop. They're always improving it. And personally, I like that a lot better when compared to how other vendors handle this. They actually use new components as an excuse to sell you a brand new model. Okay, to be fair, I totally see the irony here that I'm telling you guys that the Thelio desktop is like a rolling release where they're always iterating on it, and they don't force you into buying a new model while I'm also reviewing a new model. Well, to be fair, this is the first time that they've ever completely refreshed the Thelio line of desktops. And at the same time, even though they have come out with a new model, there's no requirement for you to upgrade to it. If you already have a Thelio and your existing Thelio works just fine, then there's no reason to replace it. But if you don't have a Thelio yet, then the new model becomes a great jumping on point since you can customize the accent colors, which is a great feature to have if you're buying one for the first time. So if you don't have a Thelio yet, then this is a great time with this new model to jump on board. But what about the operating system? Well, let's switch gears and talk about the operating system that ships with this computer. As you may already know, System76 has designed their own distribution of Linux, and they call it Pop! OS. Maybe you've heard of it. As for me, it's actually my favorite Linux distribution when it comes to desktops and laptops. But Pop! OS is not specific to System76 machines. You can install Pop! OS on any PC that has supported hardware. For example, I have a ThinkPad in the studio right now that's been running Pop! OS for quite a while. And you would think that it was actually made for that ThinkPad, but actually they just have really good desktop compatibility with Pop! OS. But even if you're not a fan of Pop! OS, you can also configure this computer with Ubuntu as well if you want to go that direction instead. But considering that System76 goes through the trouble of ensuring that your computer, if you buy one through them, contains only Linux-compatible parts, the out-of-the-box experience becomes really good because that experience is basically the same as you would get with a proprietary computer, and maybe that might make you think that the operating system was built specifically for their hardware, even when it's, well, not. Pop! OS can be installed on any computer that supports Linux, even if it's not made by System76. They don't force you to buy their hardware. You can buy their hardware, but you could download Pop! OS for free right now, and you can install it on whatever computer you happen to have. There's nothing stopping you. And you know what? The experience with that operating system is still going to be great. Just like with any PC that you'd purchase from a company like Dell or Lenovo, when you first power on the Thelio, it'll take you through some initial setup screens, and those setup screens will help you adjust various settings to make the experience your own. As part of this, you'll even be prompted to enable encryption if you want that, and after you make your choices, the installation is finalized and then the machine reboots. And then once you log in for the very first time, another screen appears that allows you to further customize the operating system. And once that's done, you can go ahead and start using it. As for Pop! OS itself, it's full of great features. And I often talk about those features anytime I review a new release of that distribution. And sure, I could go through all of the things that I like about Pop! OS right here in this video, but since I already do that in the reviews that I also release on this channel, I'll just give you a card right about here for my latest Pop! OS review, and you can definitely check that video out if you want to learn more about why Pop! OS is so awesome. But in summary, Pop! OS includes some exciting features, such as tiling, a custom workspace implementation, and countless refinements and adjustments all over the place. Sure, other desktop distributions out there can give you a good experience on the desktop, but Pop! OS is the only distribution that I've used personally that gives you a best-in-class experience. It's not that any other distro is bad or anything like that, it's just that System76 knocks it out of the park when it comes to Pop! OS. So, what's my overall opinion when it comes to this newly refreshed model of the Thelio from System76? Well, I think there's a lot to love here. The swappability of the accent panel on the front of the chassis is really cool. I love that a lot. And there's, like I mentioned, a lot of refinements all over the place. I mean, there's refinements inside, outside, there's just small tweaks everywhere that just make the experience even better than it was before. But the experience isn't so much better that I'm going to tell you to ditch your current Thelio if you already have one and buy this new model. But if you don't already have a Thelio, then there's never been a better time to check it out. The only real complaint that I have with this computer, like I mentioned earlier, is that there's no USB ports on the front of the tower. I think that that's something that we definitely need the Thelio to have in some form or fashion. I feel like System76 can definitely come out with a solution for that. But even if not, That USB hub that I talked about earlier is a great workaround. It's inexpensive, and maybe that just might solve the problem. And who knows, maybe System76 could just include that in the box and that would probably just fix the problem. But other than the lack of a front USB port or two, I think that this desktop is really awesome. Again, it's not going to be so awesome that I'm going to tell you to ditch your current hardware and buy a brand new computer, but if you are already in the market for a new computer, or if you haven't jumped on board the Thelio line of desktops yet, then it's never been a greater time to check it out. Anyway, thank you so much for checking out this review. I really appreciate it. Definitely click that like button if you found this review helpful, and I'll see you in the next video.